Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and to Brian and Claire and everyone here for inviting me back. And may I just say, it's such a pleasure to talk to you all. I think this is a really terrific program. I'm old enough now that it didn't exist when I was in college, but I really wish it did, because I definitely would have applied to go on it. And I know in previous years, when we've had a chance to go around the table and find out what everyone's doing, it's always so interesting and fascinating. And I hope you've all had a terrific couple of months here, and I hope you all stay engaged very much as well in the years to come. I'll just maybe start with a couple of observations, because I think it's a really sort of interesting and somewhat worrying time for a country like Ireland, looking at the future of its foreign policy, because a lot of things are changing. I do think over the last 5 or 7 years or so, the world has sort of fundamentally changed, and we've moved from an era where we all sort of assumed, as President Obama used to say, there was sort of an arc of history, and we were all maybe along that path of progress, and the world was becoming more open and more interconnected. And over time, countries have become more, liberalized. China, Russia, Brazil would become a more sort of responsible stakeholder and active participant in the international order. And what's been sort of striking is we've gone backwards, right? So it's not just that path of progress has been a bit zigzaggy, it's actually that we've regressed significantly. So in a country like China, it's much more authoritarian today than it was 10 years ago. Here, in the US has become a lot less multilateral, and obviously there are questions about the Trump administration and where the US is going to go in the world. We have Brexit, and these are all things that I think are fundamentally sort of challenging to a country like Ireland, because it's not just Ireland, it's countries that are sort of small and open and dependent on sort of a benign international environment. There are 193 countries today. 50 years ago there was less than 50, right? So the reason we have so many now is because the environment is actually pretty hospitable to small countries, right? That you don't need to be very big to survive. And so if the world becomes more dangerous or hostile, I think it does sort of raise significant challenges. So the first point I would make, I guess, in terms of if you're looking at foreign policy for Ireland, is that Ireland really has a stake in a world that is safe for small countries to thrive and prosper in. And Ireland actually has a lot in common with other small countries around the world. It's not just in Europe, because small countries really need and benefit from openness and from having a rules-based element to the international system or international order. And that's really what's sort of challenged at the moment. And I think that is a really, Ireland is sort of not really neutral in that, right? We have this old sort of debate about neutrality, but I think Ireland very much has a stake in that system. The second thing is that if you just look at something like neutrality and how it came about initially, it was partly because of geographical proximity, right? Ireland was sort of very far away from the center of action, right? So in Central Europe, when you had that division, it was sort of irrelevant to Ireland in a way, because Ireland was located between with the US and Britain and continental Europe, and so there was sort of a safety there. So we weren't sort of on those front lines. But if you look at where conflicts occurring today, it's partly about geography, right? So there are these territorial disputes, but it's also in technology, in the technological sphere. It's on the cyber domain. I'm sure you've heard about this from previous speakers. And it so happens that Ireland has one of the largest centers of technology in Europe. So Ireland is very much at the front lines of that, but we don't really think or spend much either time or resources on cybersecurity or on sort of thinking about that dimension to it. The 5G question, which we really see burst on the scene in the last 12 months or so, that's just the beginning, for countries. All countries will have to try to figure this out. And it's not just a technology thing, it's a geopolitical thing. It has to do with sort of values and long-term interests. So I think, Ireland's going to have to think more strategically about all of these questions, but it's not going to be sort of the old style, discussions like the whole European army question. That's just actually sort of irrelevant, right? Because firstly, that's sort of overbaked in terms of what it would mean. But secondly, no country in Europe is going to sort of be saying you have to participate if you don't want to, right? There'll be lots of sort of opt-outs, and there can be, a principled, legitimate discussion with multiple sides in that. But I think it's more of a distraction to actually the real issues, which are these new domains where, Ireland will be dragged into those sort of one way or the other. It's not sort of a matter of choice. And then the final thing I would just, the final thing I would say is on the sort of global economy side. We are, I think, we have had this very open system, and we are sort of at the beginning of sort of a new era of protectionism, and quite how that sort of pans out, I think, is a huge unknown. But Ireland obviously would not benefit from a world that was heavily protectionist. Now, maybe, if Ireland is part of, the EU and the EU remains quite open and the world is a bit more protectionist, that's a much better system where the whole world is protectionist and Ireland doesn't benefit by links in with any others. But I think you see it on something like this Mercosur agreement recently, which I know at home has been very controversial because of the sort of farming side. And those are legitimate, concerns. But every country has concerns like that. The question is, how do you sort of address those concerns while keeping, this open system that does change, because it needs to change to accommodate these new rising economies. It can't be, the old system of 50 years ago where it's just Europe and the US and maybe Japan. We have to bring in, Brazil, Indonesia, India, China, and others, and that is going to sort of challenge us in fundamental ways. But I might stop there, but those are just some initial thoughts.
I'm glad they are the initial thoughts, because that's kind of where this is going to steer anyway. So as I've mentioned, we're on the WIP papers. So with our group, we've taken two priorities with looking at China and Africa and kind of Irish relations there. But in your book, All Measures Short of War, the contest for the 21st century and the future of American power, you kind of argue that we're kind of inching back towards what we've had before in terms of the normal state of great power competition and zero-sum conflict. And you've argued that the prominence of the US and the ideology that exists here, that it's only temporary, or like it's a pretense, I guess, in terms of how China and Russia have been really just biding time to some degree, perhaps, and that there was never really an intention of converting towards that liberal democracy. And you argued in favour of responsible competition over a grand strategy of offshore balancing or managing of the regional spheres. So when you're focusing on increasing US diplomacy, alliance maintenance, and the deep engagement with the world, I think it's an interesting thing to look at these two different, I guess, potential superpowers. Well, superpower with China, but potential superpower. And as you just mentioned, in terms of looking at Brazil and how there's more emerging economies that need to be taken into the fold. We focused on enhancing relationships with China ourselves in our WIP paper through encouraging sustainable and secure investment in the Republic of Ireland tech industry, and also the Northern Ireland kind of manufacturing and engineering services, because that's what kind of we see the island of Ireland having to offer at the moment. However, a large portion of the conversation that we've had has revolved around how and if we should continue expanding our reliance and relationships with China, considering the cultural differences between Ireland and China and their contribution to things that we kind of try and stand against in terms of climate change and human rights issues. So do you think that it's possible for the island of Ireland, so Northern Ireland and the Republic, to improve our relationship with China whilst remaining true to our core values and also remaining allies with the US?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and thanks for plugging the book. But no, thanks.
It's available on Amazon.
No, it's a great question, and it's a question everyone is really grappling with, especially in Europe. Like 3 or 4 years ago, when we had conversations with European officials about, China, and they would usually say, America is way overreacting to China, that it's heavily focused on security because of US interests in Asia, and Europe has a fundamentally different approach because it doesn't see China as a challenger or competitor, it sees it as an economic partner. And, Merkel went there a lot and sort of talked to, Chinese leaders about deepening Chinese investment in Europe. And you never hear that today, right? I mean, that's not where Western Europe, particularly Eastern Europe's a little bit different, but it's not where Western European governments are at, because they are increasingly concerned about Chinese investment and Chinese influence in Europe. And they're not opposed to it, right? They're not, their view isn't, we can't deal with China. China is the second largest and may soon be the largest economy in the world. You have to sort of engage, and you have to, partner economically. The question is, like, under what conditions, right? And what are sort of the terms of that? And there are parts that are, that are maybe a little exaggerated in terms of the risk, and there are parts that aren't, right? So, if China sort of buys let's say a big, some signature buildings, right, in a city, people may say, oh, how, this is, worrying. This used to be in, German or Irish or British hands for quite a while. But that's really no different than the similar discussion about Japan or others in the past, right? That, I think, is sort of overwrought. But when you're talking about sensitive areas of technology infrastructure, right, or you're talking about this Belt and Road Initiative, which doesn't even live up to the guidelines that China itself has embraced in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? It operates outside of that framework, and it's associated with corruption and with all sorts of sort of dodgy sort of elements. Then I think that does raise significant questions. And so I think what those of us who are sort of, worried about some of this would say is that, by all means, sort of engage with China economically, but don't do so purely on an economic basis. Like, take into account sort of the geopolitical element, and take into account, the difference in values and in systems of government. I mean, I think it is very little to me to do with culture, right? It really has nothing to do with culture at all, because you have countries of very different, cultures that live up to the same type of values and the same type of standards. The question is really of different sort of systems of governance. And the 5G discussion is a good one. It's because it's really about sort of future intentions, right? Do you want to make certain sunk investments, that you can't possibly reverse later on because it would be prohibitively expensive, in a system where, to a government that has a very, very different sort of authoritarian system. So I had a conversation recently with some senior officials from a European country that is, was engaged with China on this, and they said that there was a question whether they would allow 5G in their cars, right? And they realized that that Huawei was asking for the ability to be able to turn off any car if they had that in. They needed that capacity, right? Because they needed that in China. But for this very major European car firm to do that, they would have to have done it globally, which would essentially mean that, this Chinese company would have control over potentially over any car that's been driven in Europe. Well, you can't possibly divorce that sort of question, right, from questions of governance, right? Because we insist on that in our own societies in terms of certain rights and a rule of law and a court system. So I think these are very difficult. These are very difficult sort of questions. But I would be fairly skeptical on the critical infrastructure side and technology of allowing sort of Chinese investment, but pretty sort of open to it on other industries. There's a phrase bouncing around at the moment. The two phrases. One is sort of decoupling. To what extent do you want to pull back? And everyone sort of agrees you can't really decouple completely, right? That's a fallacy. But that you can't just remain engaged as if nothing has changed either. And so the second phrase that's bouncing around is sort of small yard, high fence. How do you basically make it as small as possible an area where you don't really sort of engage, but have a lot of protections there, and those are on questions I think of data, of 5G and sort of critical infrastructure, and then maybe sensitive technological innovation, like technological transfer and artificial intelligence and quantum computing.
Perfect, thank you. And then, as I said, the second priority for ours was Africa, but it also is impacted a lot by that Chinese discussion in terms of infrastructure and engagement and development there. So considering the role that China is playing in Africa, Central and South America, and in terms of conflict and acquisitions that are going on in the areas, whether related or not, how can smaller countries like Ireland and Northern Ireland make an impact in affecting global governance, human rights, while also furthering or maintaining their relationships? And do you think that these countries can take a significant place and priority for these countries in Irish and US foreign policy that can lead to better development that fits with the Irish and US culture, despite that you say culture doesn't feed perhaps as much into it anymore, compared to what China's offering? So in terms of your book, in increased diplomacy, alliance maintenance and engagement, what does this look like in development, and what role can Northern Ireland and Ireland play, do you think?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's another great question. So I think it would be, to me, like it would. I think Africa, when you look at it, it's one of the, the parts of the world that has the most sort of growth, not just population-wise, but economically over the next sort of 20 years. And you've large parts of the world that are sort of contracting, and Africa is not. And what worries me in part about how we sort of think about Africa is that we often think about it through our sort of prisms of what's important to us, right? So in the US, it's at the moment about sort of terrorism or extremism, or sometimes it's about development, or on other occasions it's about sort of something else. But we have to engage with these regions on their sort of terms, right? And as an opportunity rather than just as a challenge. And I think it would be a mistake to look at Africa through the prism of competition with China, right? That there's this sort of zero sum, that when China is sort of engaged, the US has to be there, in part because I think, that was the mindset during the Cold War, and it got us into a lot of trouble. So we need to remain pretty focused on sort of where it's important to compete, and then to partner or to cooperate or to be sort of, to be tolerant of each other's sort of, policies elsewhere. So I think it will be a mistake in that ground. I think it will also be a mistake because, what China is offering is often not something the US can sort of, or Europe or Ireland can compete on, right? Because you can't just go in with unconditional loans, right, that may not be sort of repaid, that doesn't live up to the standards of, of international lending, whether it's in the World Bank or in Europe or elsewhere. That would be a mistake as well. So I think what China is sort of doing in Africa actually is developing its own antibodies, right? So if it goes in with a project, like a typical project would be, they would go in and purchase sort of a large dam or something else, or make a commitment to build something significant. The loans will be unconditional. There will be ambiguity, let's put it kindly, in terms of why that was necessarily accepted. And then the project would sort of go bust, and they would have the asset, and that money would need to be repaid. Well, it turns out that's not very popular in all of these countries, right? And so people sort of resent that, and then they may renationalize it or push back. And so I think that a country like Ireland or Europe more generally has to sort of insist on maintaining these sort of high standards of investment and lending. And I think we also need to, to not sort of fall into the protectionist trap of having sort of a fortress Europe, right? That doesn't actually engage with Africa economically. One thing that probably doesn't come up as much for Ireland is the migration question, which I think is a huge sort of challenge in North Africa, obviously for Europe, maybe one of the biggest challenges. And there, I think, the temptation is just to continue this sort of crisis management, sort of propping up, various warlords or forces in Libya or elsewhere to try to stem the tide of refugees and migrants. But I think that long term is not sustainable. Like we really need to remain focused on governance, right? People sort of leave not so much for economic opportunity, but because they don't feel safe, right? Because their families are endangered, or because the state is sort of broken down. And I think Europe needs to do more on that. I think that's sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit over the last sort of 10 years. So I would hope Ireland will play a role in that too.
Thank you. All right, we're all ready to go. So with that, we'll open up to the floor. I'm going to start over here with Kirsty, if that's all right. I'd say if you just... Yeah, if we just...
So I was at it's like Captive Nations Week this week.
Oh, by the way, could you just say where you are for the summer as well? It'd just be interesting to...
I'm Kirsty, and I am at the office of Congressman Brendan Boyle, who's a Democrat from Pennsylvania. So I was at this summit held by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and they were talking about human rights breaches going on in China, North Korea, Venezuela, Cambodia. There are representatives from all over. And one thing that struck me is that there are 3 million people in concentration camps, essentially, in China at the moment. It's not a question of like having different values or different ways of doing things. It's a question of urgent, horrendous human rights abuse going on right now. And so I guess my question is, how, with any kind of moral compass, can we continue to engage, even economically, with countries like China, who are like in this huge mass way infringing and abusing people's human rights?
Thank you for the question. It's a really important one. And I think, we haven't spoken nearly enough about what's going on in Xinjiang. And we're beginning to, countries are beginning to raise it. And Europe actually has done quite a bit. Europe raised it in the discussions with China in the EU-China dialogue for the first time. The European Parliament passed a resolution on it. I very much sort of believe that this has to be part of our policy toward China, right? That you can't just sort of set it aside, because firstly, what's happening there is a tragedy for the Uyghur population, and I think it's a human rights abuse that needs to be addressed. But also, it's really about sort of perfecting the tools of dictatorship, right? So you see, one of the things I would really encourage you to think about is the way in which some of these old sort of trends of authoritarianism or populism are changing with technology, right? So the use of sort of facial recognition software and developments in AI in China allow a measure of control that previously, dictators couldn't have possibly dreamed of, right? So you have these social credit scores, where you might be assessed by facial recognition in terms of who you're meeting with. So, if you're a Chinese citizen and you met with someone like me, that might be -5 points, and if you praise Xi Jinping, that must be +5 points, and ultimately that affects whether or not you can go to college or maybe even get an exit visa or the type of job you can get, or if you become a civil servant, right? So that's happening just in China writ large. What's happening in Xinjiang is like that to the nth degree, right? So it's a much, and in some ways they're perfecting those tools there. My sort of sense is that, China is very, very sensitive about any of this being raised. And, there's a few issues. This is one, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or others, where, they react very angrily if this is raised. And the only countries that can really raise it are large ones, right? Because I think it's not, China is such a major player economically. I don't think it's possible to sort of disengage, but the question is whether or not you bring in human rights and values as part of the policy. And when you think about a country like China, pretty much every country is a small country other than the United States, right? And the European Union, if you count the EU as a sort of an individual unit. And so I've been sort of encouraged by how the EU is sort of speaking up with one voice on this. China is trying to divide the EU on it, but I think it's incredible. And I think this is one of the big mistakes of Brexit as well, is that individual European countries can only be influential on this if they all hang together, right? Because otherwise they can just be singled out and sort of penalized. And if it is raised as an issue, it won't solve the issue, but I think it does help. Because I think they're very sort of sensitive to public criticism, and I think they will they will make some sort of adjustments, but it won't sort of address the problem fundamentally. But I think we need to be very persistent on it, and to continuously raise it and to make it a central part of the dialogue, not just to do what countries often do, which is they have the human rights dialogue is like a tiny part. They raise it and then they forget about it, right? We have to sort of do that, and I think that we are sort of seeing that in Europe, thankfully, and to some extent here as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think decompartmentalizing is definitely the way forward on addressing our foreign policy. Yeah, would you like to?
Hi.
Hi, good morning. My name is Niamh O'Keefe. I did WIP back in 2007, so I think that's about 100 years ago. And I interned with Congressman Peter King. Thanks so much for your time this morning. After WIP, I went on and did a master's in international relations, so unpicking the nuances of these kind of things is right up my street. But for my undergrad, I did history. And I think we can all fall into the trap of thinking, and it's part of the human condition, that the time we're living in now is the most tumultuous and it's the most complex, and no one has faced the challenges and things that we've before. But history teaches us that actually that's been most people's experience since the dawn of time and civilization. So I'd love to know, what are you optimistic about in terms of, despite all the uncertainty in Trump and Brexit and China and us maybe particularly, I think, Western countries not being so clear on our place in the world or what the new world order is going to be. What do you think about that gives you optimism?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. It would have been the perfect final question, actually.
We can come back to it if you want.
Well, one of the things that sort of, I think, is sort of contradictory about the world we live in is people are very anxious. They're worried about what's happening. There's a lot to be concerned about, but the overall metrics have rarely been better, right? So life expectancy is, is pretty much as good or better than it's ever been. Basic sort of metrics of poverty, of child health, all sorts of metrics are positive, and not just because of what's happened in India and China, right? So it's not just hundreds of millions of people taken out of poverty there, which is an amazing sort of accomplishment. It's also just more general sort of global improvements. And there are several sort of books making this argument, actually saying, why are people so anxious? Because it's never been so good. Steven Pinker's written this book, sort of The Better Angels of Our Nature, really about how violence and war has sort of plummeted over time, right, rather than increased as most people feel it has. And I think that all sort of gives me optimism, actually. I mean, I think we shouldn't downplay, the problems, but I think there are lots of opportunities. In some ways, it's never been a better time, to be alive. Like you have, just all of these things are sort of trending in the right direction. I think we are sort of seeing, those basic development indicators improving, but the political indicators, I think, are regressing. And I think that does give us sort of pause. And I think what we saw over the last sort of 30 years or so was sort of a post-Cold War bump. And we are sort of going back to something a little more worrying and familiar. It doesn't mean it's more complicated than before. I mean, even in the worst case scenario, I think, well, maybe not the very worst case scenario, but in bad case scenarios, what we're encountering is still better, than the 30s or obviously, World War I or height of the Cold War. But it's still challenging. So we need to deal with the challenges that we have. And we are, facing those at a time of really incredible technological change. The technological change that we've all sort of experienced since sort of the dawn of the internet, what we're about to encounter, I think, on quantum computing, AI and other areas could be as significant again as that. And I think it raises all sorts of, not just political and geopolitical questions, but basic questions of an economic model, about the future of work, ethical dilemmas. And so we're going to have to sort of work through, and you're going to have to in particular work through all of that. Yes.
I think we're going to go to this year's Peter King in turn. So we'll go with Lindsay over this side.
Hiya. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lindsay, and I study international relations at University College London. So foreign policy, definitely
Great.
An interest of mine. I wanted to ask a question on a topic that might seem quite strange, but it's been very much something that I've been looking at this week, and that is to do with Russia. Russia has kind of fallen into the background with everything that's going on with Iran, but very much still issues are existing. I was at a talk this week with Vladimir Seltsev, a Russian foreign policy professor from Moscow, who has said now that we're very much in a new Cold War, and that the threat of nuclear war is at the highest it's been since the original Cold War. With that, he is saying that the period that we're about to go into in the last 4 years of Putin's presidency, that those 4 years are going to be the worst part of Russian-American relations, especially, he says, if a Democrat gets into office, which might just be his personal opinion. What I want to ask really is, can you assess the threat of nuclear war? Is this something that we should actually be looking at as a serious issue in today's world?
Was he Russian? Sorry, this guy?
He was Russian,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
he was very critical of the Russian government.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. So one thing you hear, so Russian analysts and Russian experts often say that the threat of nuclear war is, incredibly high, right? And that's sort of a common refrain, just to make it wrong, right? It is sort of part of the pattern of what they say. And that's generally interpreted here as wanting to sort of almost recreate the brinksmanship of the Cold War to make the Russia-US relationship incredibly central and to give Moscow sort of additional leverage. I mean, I think that when you have, the first and second largest, nuclear arsenals in the world, you always have to be concerned, right? And so you always have to be worried about that, and we can never sort of take our eye off that ball. And, it's important to engage in strategic stability discussions with Russia, because of that. But I don't think it's higher than it's ever been. I think it's largely sort of manageable. There are certain things to be worried about, the INF issues being one of those. But I think when you look at Putin, I think he's someone, firstly, I think he'll be there a lot longer than 4 years. I think they'll carry him out of that place in a coffin probably at some point. You know, like he's going to be in there, I think, till he dies, right? I mean, and he's not that old. You know, he's like 68, I think. So he could be easily there for another 15 years into his 80s. And this face app thing, you know, started in a way with a picture of Putin being old, you know, as in his 80s. But with Xi Jinping and Putin, they're both around the same age, and they'll both be there, I think, for a significant period of time, unless something traumatic happens. Neither intends to sort of leave office. But he, I think, is he's quite adept at knowing how to destabilize certain situations, knowing how to advance Russia's interests. But he's also sort of cognizant of the risk of going too far. You know, he's not like a sort of a Hitler-style person who's incredibly impatient and has no sense of limits. And I think if Putin, and one of the things I've rethought a little bit over the last few years is that, you know, if Putin was going to make a move into the Baltics, I think he might have done it over the last few years, you know, when somebody like an American president was ambiguous about NATO, right? And he didn't. Now, he did lots of really nefarious things elsewhere, you know, in Syria, attacks on, you know, election systems here and elsewhere, some of the things he's been doing in Libya, Ukraine, obviously. So I think what we're likely to see is a continuing period of sort of unconventional warfare and political warfare from Russia. I think if there's a Democrat elected, I think it will be the first time in several decades that the president hasn't tried a reset to come in, you know, because every president has tried a reset of sorts, including Trump. So that's unlikely to happen, largely because of Putin, I think, because people just don't believe it's possible. But there is a more fundamental question about how do you get to a sort of an equilibrium, right, where we can not move past what's happened, but sort of manage it in a sort of a stable way. And there's an ongoing discussion about that. I don't know exactly sort of how to do it, but I think part of the answer is about making the relationship contingent on Russia's future behavior, right? So if, you know, Russia interferes massively in this coming election, I think that will affect the incoming, if there is a Democratic president, their policy toward him. If he does not, then I think that will also affect it in a more positive way, in just that they are, you know, if the intelligence community says they hadn't interfered, there may be more of an opportunity for dialogue. So I think what people will probably be looking at is how to make it, you know, contingent on Putin's behavior rather than, you know, just on political dynamics here, if that makes sense.
Right. I've been told I can ask 2 more questions, so we're going to go with...
Should we take them in a group or?
Yeah, if we want to, we'll go with Mark and Owen. If you want to, we'll do kind of...
If there's anyone else, we can group them together if there's
Yeah.
anyone else. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So my name is Mark Finn. I'm interning at Honeywell in their government relations team at the moment, and I just graduated from my degree in economics and political science. So my question is kind of touching on what you were mentioning earlier in terms of what Ireland's role can be, and kind of following on from what Megan asked. I suppose one of the key things we know about the international system is that larger states like China, like US, like Russia, because of their economic and military might, tend to have a lot more influence than smaller ones. And some of the power we've kind of been told of smaller ones comes from multilateral bodies like the EU. I guess what I'm wondering is, in terms of, say, for example, you know, insisting on higher standards for investment coming in that you discussed earlier, where can like a state like Ireland get its power to actually do that? Where do we have that influence? And does it best come from that state acting individually or through an international body, considering the pushback against multilateralism that we're seeing at the moment?
Thanks.
Yeah, and Owen?
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Owen Finn. I'm from Galway. I just finished studying human rights, economics and French, and I spent part of my degree in Strasbourg looking at how European politics seem to be developing. And I'm really interested in what you're saying about Fortress Europe and how Ireland isn't really served by that, and Ireland isn't really served by a protectionist Europe. Especially now with Jean-Claude Juncker, and I know he's on the way out, or well, out the door now at this stage, but what he was saying, what everyone from Salvini to Macron was saying before the last European election was this idea of a Europe that protects. That was the one thing that united everyone from the former Eurosceptics who now see Europe as their possible vector to protectionism and xenophobia, and to liberals who saw this also as a way to get people behind the European ideals. So my question to you is, what do you think Ireland can do to make sure that doesn't happen? I see that it's in our interest to make sure it doesn't happen. What steps do you propose that Ireland could take? And thank you so much for a really insightful discussion.
Thanks. Any others, or we're good?
So kind of looking
Okay,
at Ireland's role then in terms of the
Brian have
protection
one?
and in terms of the investment.
Okay. Well, just on that, on your question first. I mean, so I didn't mean to criticize the Europe that protects thing. Actually, I think there's a difference between that and Fortress Europe, right? I mean, I think what Macron meant by that was, a Europe in a world that's much more volatile, and with all of this changed, how do you ensure that citizens see Europe as something, that helps sort of protect their basic rights, right? So Europe has actually been to the forefront of this on the GAFA issues, Google, Amazon, Facebook. Europe has been a lot further advanced in thinking through some of those challenges. And America, you see in the Democratic primary, a lot of American candidates are now following that sort of example to say, well, you can't just sort of engage Silicon Valley unconditionally. You have to think about some of these larger questions. Where I think Macron would see that as an example, of where Europe, would protect the rights of its citizens. There are other sort of questions as well. And so I think the general sort of sentiment is correct. The question, of course, is it's all in the definition, right? So someone like Salvini can mean something fundamentally different than from Macron. I think shaping that debate is maybe where Ireland should be. I think Ireland does benefit from a strong sort of EU, and I think Ireland's influence in large part will come from that, right, rather than from an individual voice. Like the individual voice is important, and if Ireland's elected to the UN Security Council next year, that will come to the forefront again. But I think it really long term, it's sort of through the EU, and I think Ireland does have a benefit in the EU that is a more sort of autonomous actor. I worry a little bit that discussion at home will be seen through the prism of neutrality in a very narrow sense. Whereas, as I said earlier, while I think there are legitimate views on both sides of that, I just think that's not the main thing, right? That's not actually the center of gravity of this, right? The contingencies that would involve sort of Ireland being forced to join a European army and engage in some military conflict, I think, to me, are just seem very far outside the likely scenarios. Like, I mean, it's possible, I guess, but it's much more likely that that Europe finds itself confronted with challenges in the technology sphere or on investment or global economy or human rights or other issues. And there, I think a common voice is important. On your question, which was on sort of investment and the
non-investment specific
Standards, right?
the standards.
Setting standards and kind of how does Ireland have a role in kind of ensuring these standards are kind of followed through on a global level?
Yeah, I think part of it is just doing what was doing at the moment. But I think what's going to be different is on the tech side, right? I think you already see this with the way in which the concentration of tech industry in Ireland has given Ireland a special role on regulation, and that maybe no one was quite ready for, right, in the rest of Europe or in Ireland. I think a lot of good things are being done there, but I think we will, if that sort of continues, we will see, Ireland occupying a place, in Europe, whereas it has outsized importance on technology, and I just think that is an area, if I were one of you, that I would be really looking into much more. I mean, I'm struck that some of the major investigative pieces on Ireland's relationship with the tech sector have not come from Irish writers or journalists, right? They've come from European writers, and when I look at the Irish sort of press, often those questions are not front and central. They're not front and central in the Oireachtas either. And I think that's partly a generational thing. I think your generation will make those much more central, because it's just working with gravity, right? That's where it's headed, and that I think is the area to be sort of looking at in depth, and I think that's where Ireland may have sort of an outsized role in it, and I think that's also going to be a particularly difficult area because it's going to mean sort of disaggregating Ireland's narrow economic interest, which is in just an incredibly good relationship with these companies, toward one that is also looking out for the European interests. And I don't quite know how you balance those two things, but that is going to be sort of a requirement, right? So I think there's lots of new questions, lots of issues that people, the current and my generation even don't, just aren't that literate in or aren't that aware of. And I think that's really what I would sort of focus on. Nice.
Thank
Brian?
you. I think Brian's going to...
Tom and Megan, thanks so much. So I'll do the same. I'm Brian. I'm the director of the program. I'm conscious. I gave you both a brief to steer away from Brexit, and I'm conscious that maybe I'll avoid.
And we didn't talk about Trump either.
I know.
I
It's
have
been
a
great
question
if I'm
about Brexit
honest.
and Trump. And maybe I'll just, the book has been plugged, but I'll just plug your a couple of podcasts as well, Tom, for those that are interested in this. You've hosted a number of really fascinating discussions under the Brookings event series, with Martin Selmayr and with Speaker Burko in the last kind of couple of months. And I know it yourself and Amanda have done some really interesting things on Brexit. So with those two, I think you have a unique perspective, obviously coming from Ireland, but being the director of the US-EU Centre in Brookings kind of gives you, and being an American citizen too, gives you kind of a different perspective on issues here. 2 years ago, just after President Trump was elected, you spoke at a WIP event, and I'm glad that we've recorded it, and it's something that I think people, it's the first time I heard the phrase mercantilist, and that idea of a kind of America First policy, and what did that mean? Just from your perspective now, a couple of years into it, and whether there's another 5 years of Trump or whether American foreign policy changes, how do you see kind of Brexit playing out from the US perspective, and what are the kind of, from a Northern Irish and Irish perspective, what are the key concerns or if there are any opportunities in how this kind of all plays out, and just how do you see it now a couple of years on?
Thanks.
So an easy question to end.
So didn't avoid it entirely.
Nearly there.
So firstly, I think so Ireland's an exception to what I'm about to say, right? But one of the peculiar things about Brexit is that Britain and the rest of the EU don't seem to believe it's all that important, right? So when you talk to Brexiteers, they basically say, we want to get out of the EU because we want sovereignty, but nothing will change, right? We'll be as prosperous as we were. We'll be more prosperous. We'll be more influential. We'll have better trade deals. The only thing that will be different is that things will be just better across the board, right? So it's not really that important, right? So when they come to America, they say, we want this trade deal. We want to work with you, but we'll still be, global Britain. We'll still be incredibly, involved and engaged. And the rest of the EU, their response has been, Brexit is an internal issue in the Conservative Party, and it's not really that important, and it's not really a priority, right? So when you have these meetings, they'll say, well, we're preoccupied with, refugees or with Trump or with global trade, and Brexit is one of those things we have to deal with. We wish we didn't, but it's really not that important. And I think it's just much more important than either sort of makes it out. I think it's probably the most important thing to happen in Europe since the end of the Cold War and the fall of the wall. I think it is an ordering event. It's not just a political thing. Yes, it's because of this Conservative Party, civil war or issues in the Conservative Party, but it doesn't really matter actually that it's a part of that. What matters is the consequence. And it's been a matter of great regret to me that the US has not been involved at all. I think the US could have played a very constructive role. I think if you did see a different administration, you would have seen very significant involvement at the highest levels on Northern Ireland and the backstop and, the assembly and all of those questions. And I think, I don't want to be overly, optimistic about those alternative scenarios, but I think that may not have been an issue, right? If you did have more high-level U.S. engagement, right? I think if you had someone like, Bill Clinton working full-time on this and engaging with the DUP and with Sinn Féin and others, I think it might have been different. So I think the U.S. has taken its eye off the ball on it. But I wanted to say one other thing, though, about sort of Ireland and Brexit, which I think gets directly into this foreign policy question, because I think Ireland has very significant choices coming up on Brexit, and I think the backstop is very understandable, and was a solution to a very real problem. I do think it's really important to think about the very long term, though. That there's nothing is permanent, right, in international politics. So if Ireland has a guarantee that the backstop is permanent, it's not. Nothing is permanent, right? If the backstop doesn't work after a decade, then it won't exist, even if they're locked into it legally, because a country the size of the UK will figure a way out, and the politics in the rest of Europe will change. A future German chancellor will reverse their position. A future French president, right? Nothing goes on forever, and I do think that what's happening in Britain is just what's particularly this week, and with a new prime minister and just reversing any progress that's been made and going right back to the beginning is just profoundly depressing, and I think incredibly self-destructive. But I think it is at the same time really important to try to think about ways to avert sort of no deal, because it's not obvious to me that no deal will be very short and that Britain will just surrender and come back at the end of that. That could happen. That's the baseline assumption in Brussels, but we just don't really know how that will come out. So I hope that if, I believe that Taoiseach and Foreign Minister and others are sort of obviously very deeply engaged in this. I think they've got good judgment on it. I think whatever they decide, I think it's really important that they have the political space to do so, and so as we sort of enter these few months, I think it's, leaders on all sides, including sort of Johnson, presuming he is the Prime Minister, and the Taoiseach, that they have this sort of space to figure out, not ending the backstop or anything like that, but trying to come up with innovative solutions to avert a no-deal and Brexit. And much as we want to see Brexit sort of reversed, some way to ensure that if it does happen, because I think it will happen at this stage in some way, shape or form, because of the threat Farage poses to the Conservative Party, I think they've no other option, that we really need to as an international community, but particularly Ireland, and I would like to think the US, but I think it's unlikely under Trump, need to sort of engage heavily in this to make sure that it's, that worst case scenarios are sort of averted. Because that's, I think, one of the only sort of major shocks, to Ireland that sort of exists out there, and we shouldn't be sort of complacent about, about how bad, about how that will unfold.
Thank you. It's definitely interesting to hear about kind of the US involvement that could be with Brexit, considering how they're involved in the peace process, and even the fact that we're here this summer. So, and
if we'd ended with the optimism question now, it would be,
I know, we'd all go to lunch
Brexit,
much happier. So thanks for that. But no, thank you very much for being with us here today, and for kind of giving us, I guess, a vision, especially for foreign policy and the island of Ireland's location and position moving forward in a globalized world. So thank you very much for being here today, and I hope that the people in this room can kind of pursue that vision as well. So
great. Well, thank you, and good luck to all of you on the rest of the program here and on your studies and future careers. I'm really sort of glad you're doing this, and hope to meet many of you again in the future as well. And thank you very much.
Thank you.